How's it going, everybody? Too Spooky here. In this video today, we're going to be explaining the Millennium Items from Yu-Gi-Oh! Where did they come from? What are they? And what exactly do they do? All these questions and more will be answered in the coming minutes. As a little disclaimer, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the events from the manga, as the manga is the true canon for the series, but since the anime follows a lot of the same storylines, it's also subject to be in this video. In addition to that, I must quickly warn you that my pronunciation of different names and phrases isn't always the best, in fact it's quite bad, so I'm likely going to mispronounce a few things within this video. So without further ado, it's time to dive right into it. To begin, we should first list off each of the Millennium Items. We have the Millennium Puzzle, the Millennium Eye, the Millennium Rod, the Millennium Necklace, the Millennium Ring, the Millennium Scale, and the Millennium Key. We'll talk about what each one of them do and their significance later on in the video, but first, we need to discuss where exactly these objects came from and how they obtained their respective power. If you've watched even a fraction of the series, then it should be common knowledge that the Millennium Items originated from ancient Egypt, as Egyptian lore is a pretty big staple of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. But as far as why or how they were created, that's a different story entirely. In the early and much darker chapters of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Shadi was the first person to touch upon their actual origins, although he only gave us a very brief look into their actual history. He claimed that over 3,000 years ago, the Millennium Items were created by magicians who served the pharaohs, with the purpose to punish thieves who would seek to rob the pharaohs' tombs. This brief history would later be greatly expanded upon, but before that, we got a little more information through Pegasus's backstory of how he obtained the Millennium Eye. Through his backstory, we learned of the existence of the Millennium Stone, and that the Millennium Items themselves chose their respective hosts by testing if they are worthy of their power. Through this test, we also saw what happens when you are not worthy, which apparently results in death in one way or another. But the individual we saw was being forced to test the Millennium Ring, which denied him by stabbing him with the pointy ends and then subsequently forced the man to vomit flames until he died because it literally lit his soul on fire. So these Millennium Items are pretty fucking brutal. Now, as far as how exactly they were created, we have to go back 3,000 years, where we meet Aknam Kanan, who was the pharaoh and the father of future pharaoh Atem, or essentially Pharaoh Yugi. At that time, Egypt was struggling to deal with invading forces, and as the threat grew worse and worse every day, Aknam Kanan was running out of options to protect his kingdom. His brother Akhenaten then reminded him of the Millennium Spellbook or Millennium Tomb in the manga, which had a spell that could create 7 mystical items that would have the power to stop the invading forces. So because Aknam Kanan saw no other option to protect his people, he ordered his brother to carry out this spell and forge what would become the Millennium Items. It should also be noted that Aknam Kanan was a pharaoh of peace, and did not wish to harm anyone. So something that his brother Akhenaten did not disclose to him was the fact that the spell to create the Millennium Items would need human sacrifices. In this case, to create all 7, they would need to sacrifice 99 people. Akhenaten, his fellow magicians, and some soldiers then went to the village of Kol Elna, where they massacred 99 people and threw their blood and bodies into a vat of liquid gold, which was used to cast the Millennium Items. It should also be noted that the only survivor of that massacre was Bakura, who witnessed the whole thing, so it's no wonder that he's pretty pissed off. After creating the Millennium Items, the Millennium Puzzle was given to Aknam Kanan and any future pharaoh, while the other 6 were given to the 6 Grand Priests who served under the pharaoh, which would be passed down to new priests and pharaohs accordingly. After the Millennium Items were in the possession of the priests, following that brutal ritual, the priests alone were able to ward off any invading forces by basically summoning duel monsters to attack and scare them off. This monster summoning ability is something that all 7 Millennium items are capable of doing, and the explanation for the monsters themselves goes a little something like this. Apparently, each person has a Ba and a Ka within their soul. The Ba is basically like a person's true soul or their actual life force, while the Ka is a representation of their true nature and intentions, which can turn into a good spirit or even a monster and leave that person's body. The Millennium items were able to manifest these monsters and also seal them in stone slabs during these ancient times. After the monster is sealed, the Millennium items were able to call upon these slabs to manifest the Ka within them to fight other Ka, or just other enemies in general. So they essentially have the ability to manifest actual monsters from people's souls to fight other actual monsters. Basically like dual monsters in the future, but more terrifying because they can actually kill you. So that's how the Millennium items were created. But believe it or not, the lore goes even deeper. Hearing that explanation may have brought up a new question. What in the world is the Millennium Spellbook, and where the darn heck did it come from? Well, to put it as simply as I can, we first need to introduce Zork Necrophades, which is basically a god born from the pure evil of the heart of man, which was born millions upon millions of years before the creation of the Millennium items. Because Zork was basically evil itself, it wanted to wreak havoc on the outside world, but lacked a physical form. Its power was said to be infinite, and greatly outmatched the Millennium items as well. Yet, it still couldn't just create itself its own form. It seems kind of counterproductive for someone with infinite power to not be able to do that, but whatever. Zork resided within the Shadow Realm, which it created through its own power. Because Zork wanted to one day grant itself a physical form so it could eradicate life itself, Zork created the Millennium Spellbook in the hopes that someday, someone would create the Millennium items and summon him in the process. The summoning of Zork is done by placing all 7 Millennium items into the Millennium Stone, which is a gateway to the Shadow Realm where Zork resides. It's unknown if the Millennium Stone itself was created for the spell by Akhenaten, if it was created by Zork, or if it just already existed within the world, but regardless, through this Millennium Stone and the various Millennium items, this was the only true way to summon Zork. In the past, Zork was summoned by Bakura, who was stopped by Pharaoh Atem through self-sacrifice, which sealed both Zork and Atem's soul within the Millennium Puzzle, though a fraction of Zork's soul remained within the Millennium Ring. But now that we've covered their history, let's go over what each of them are and what exactly they do. Since we're going over each of the Millennium items and how they work individually, I also just wanted to clarify that I'm not going to be covering stuff from the movies, such as the Pyramid of Light. It should first be noted that each of the Millennium items have a few abilities that are universal between all 7, and each of them also have unique abilities exclusive to each individual item. As far as the universal abilities go, they all have the ability to manifest ancient forms of magic to create shadow games, which, to put it simply, is basically like a very harsh punishment for the loser of that game, which a lot of times ends up in death. At least in the manga. You'd honestly be surprised at how many people actually die in the manga. It's pretty brutal. An example of this that you may not even have known about would be what happened to Bandit Keith. You see, in shadow games it's also strictly forbidden to perform any kind of cheating, and due to the fact Bandit Keith cheated during a shadow game, he literally had to shoot himself with a gun that manifested out of his own hand. R.I.P. Bandit Keith. It should also be noted that during a shadow game, the parties involved are sent to an alternate dimension where they cannot be interrupted through the use of that ancient magic. The ancient magic involved with shadow games can also be used for various things outside of these games, like creating illusions for instance, among many other things, but the majority of this magic involves the abilities unique to each item. However, one magic ability that each item does have in common would be the fact that they are all immune to any magic from other Millennium items, although this rule is apparently very loose. so the Millennium items also essentially protect their respective hosts from the other Millennium item magic and just ancient magic in general. But with the universal abilities out of the way, let's talk about each of them individually. The item we've got to talk about first is obviously the Millennium Puzzle. While not exactly an ability, it should first be mentioned that this item needs to be assembled before it can be used, which is essentially how it gets the name Millennium Puzzle. The puzzle itself is considered so difficult that any normal person would never have any hope to solve it. Because Yugioh himself was essentially chosen for the Millennium Puzzle, he of course was able to do so. But even though Yugioh was the chosen host, it still took him over 8 years to complete it. The main ability of the Millennium Puzzle is to increase the user's chances of winning whatever game they are playing. So in a sense, it essentially has the ability of luck itself, at least when it comes to competitive games. You thought this whole time it was actually the heart of the cards? Ha! Ha! Fuck that bullshit! Yugioh was just out here with a fucking luck boost. The Millennium Puzzle also contains the soul of Pharaoh Atem, like we mentioned earlier, which is basically an unintentional ability that allows Yugioh and Atem to switch personalities whenever they want. And since Atem was rather good at controlling monsters back in ancient times, it's no wonder he does most of the dueling. Although it's never specified how or why, it's also been said that the Millennium Puzzle is the most powerful of the Millennium items, which is most likely the reason why it was worn exclusively by the pharaohs. Atem, or Yami Yugioh, also once mentioned that unity is one of its most prominent powers, which could be interpreted as Yugioh or Atem's bond, or even the bond of Yugioh and his friends strengthening their power, or its power, I'm not really sure. It should also be noted that the Millennium Puzzle is also one of the only Millennium items that is able to interfere with the magic of the other Millennium items, but only on certain occasions. It also has a few miscellaneous abilities, such as sensing powerful monsters before they are summoned, entering people's minds, and also feeling the emotions of others. The second Millennium item is the Millennium Eye. The main ability of the Millennium Eye is the ability to look into a person's mind, which basically allows them to know what that person is thinking at all times. This ability also apparently works on people who wield a Millennium item, as we saw this happen with both Yugioh and Atem respectively. It's unknown if this is considered a plot hole, or if the Millennium Eye also just has the ability to bypass other Millennium items. Just keep that in mind. The Millennium Eye can also look right into a person's soul, being able to see hidden memories, and also if a person's soul is inhabited by another. The Millennium Eye also has the ability to see a person's cards during a duel, making the host exceptionally hard to beat, especially because the host of the Millennium Eye was Pegasus, who literally created the Duel Monsters card game, so he had a card for almost any situation. When it comes to shadow games, the Millennium Eye was also shown being able to seal a person's soul inside of a card after defeating them, which so far is exclusive to the Millennium Eye. The final ability would be the fact that the Millennium Eye is said to grant its host one wish, which sounds like a pretty overpowered ability depending on what you wish for, but in Pegasus's case, he wished to see his deceased lover once again, which did happen, but only for a few seconds. So it seems like you need to be very specific with that wish, or it's just a scam. Something I suppose I should also note is that, like we mentioned earlier, all the Millennium items have the ability to protect their hosts in one way or another with that ancient magic. Yet Bakura was just able to walk up to Pegasus and literally rip the Millennium Eye right out of his eye socket. So either the Millennium Ring is just completely OP and can counteract any defenses, or the Millennium Eye just sucks eggs in that department. The third Millennium item is the Millennium Ring. The main ability of the Millennium Ring is to locate whatever the host wants it to, which is done by the ring pointing in the direction of whatever they are looking for. So although it can't outright tell you where something is, it does show you the way. This location ability can also work for non-physical things like emotions or even energy, along with being able to locate the other Millennium items. Similar to the Millennium Puzzle, the Millennium Ring also contains someone's soul, which in this case is Bandit Bakura from the past, along with a fragment of Zork, like we mentioned earlier, which was possible due to the fact the Millennium Ring also has the ability to seal a person's soul into other objects, which includes other Millennium items and even itself. Similar to what we talked about earlier with the ring stabbing the false host before burning their soul to a crisp, the ring also has a will of its own, which could solely be because of Zork or Yami Bakura, but it also has the ability to stab its prongs into its host to prevent them from taking it off. The Millennium Ring is also said to have the most evil powers compared to the rest, which is likely because of Zork corrupting it. The fourth Millennium item is the Millennium Rod. The main ability of the Millennium Rod is mind control, essentially being able to make anyone a helpless slave and do whatever the host wants them to. This also allows the host to communicate with others telepathically, change their thoughts to whatever he wants them to think, look at their memories in general, or just simply knock them unconscious through mind manipulation. The Millennium Rod does not work on those wielding other Millennium items, and it also doesn't work on those who are basically reincarnated individuals from ancient Egypt. The ancient magic of the rod is also pretty deadly, as we've seen that it can be used for a sort of telekinetic force, along with using it to literally just destroy things. Another interesting thing to note is that underneath the shaft of the rod is a sharp blade, kind of like a stake. The blade was not present in the English version of the anime, but its purpose was not only to, stab people, but its main purpose was for the Ishtar clan to carve the pharaoh's memory on their firstborn male, which unfortunately for him happened to be Merrick. To be fair, if that happened to me, I'd be pretty pissed off too. The fifth Millennium item is the Millennium Necklace. The main and basically only ability of the Millennium Necklace is to see into the ancient past and see briefly into the immediate future. The futures that the necklace can see are also not set in stone and can be altered, which was mostly shown to happen with the interference of other Millennium items. The necklace can also see into the immediate future of a specific person, but will not work if that person is wielding a Millennium item. The sixth Millennium item is the Millennium Scale. Although we haven't really touched upon this too much with the other items, back in ancient times the scale had a specific ability, which was to fuse monsters together. So apparently the Millennium Scale was their only method of polymerization. But when it comes to its actual ability, the scale has the ability to show whether or not a person is evil, depending on which side of the scale is weighed down. During a possible shadow game which was performed by Shadi, called Weighing of the Heart, the scale is also able to decide if a person is deserving of death for their sins. This was done by placing the feather of Ma'at on one side and nothing on the other. Shadi then asked the individual questions, and if they lied or were revealed to be truly evil at heart, the side without the feather would lower. If they told the truth, the side with the feather would lower. If the side without the feather touches the ground, a motherfucking crocodile monster would just appear out of nowhere and literally eat the lying individual, so it kills them. So although this particular Millennium item was barely present in the series, it is apparently one of the most deadly. The final Millennium item is the Millennium Key, which is also the only Millennium item that doesn't have an Eye of Anubis present on it for whatever reason. The main ability of the key is to unlock the door of a person's soul, which sounds cryptic as hell, but this basically allows that person to enter what is called the Room of the Soul. Still sounds pretty cryptic, but in this Room of the Soul, the user is able to simply observe the individual's thoughts and view past memories, or they could even completely alter a person's soul, which also subsequently alters their personality as well. The personality altering can be undone by the user, or if the altered individual touches the key. The key also allows the user to turn invisible and sense when other Millennium items are transferred to new individuals. In addition to the 7 Millennium items, there's also a few different Millennium objects that are related to them in one way or another. Namely the Millennium Stone and the Millennium Spellbook, but we've already explained those earlier. But in addition to those, there's also a few cards that are directly related to the Millennium items, which are the Millennium Shield, which could actually be based on an item we never got to see, Ma'at, who if you remember the feather of Ma'at was used for the scale, and Ma'at also wields all 7 of the Millennium items in the card. And then we have the Millennium Eyes Restrict, which is covered in Millennium Eyes. But with that, we've officially explained each of the Millennium items, how they work, and how they came into existence. If you've learned something new or just found a better understanding of them as a whole, well, be sure to lightly tap that like button because people have been abusing it lately. It needs a little bit of a break, but you should still hit that like button, please. Just very softly. Also, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more content like this in the future. And while you're at it, be sure to comment what you would like explained next. I also need to mention that we've got some limited time Christmas sweaters available from now until January 1st. So if you want to be festive and support the channel at the same time, well, be sure to pick one of those up. You can find 2 links for those in the description. Now with that, everybody, if you cannot get enough of that Yu-Gi-Oh content, well, be sure to click here for 101 facts about Yu-Gi-Oh. Thanks for watching. See you all next time with a new video.